Ethan Granger stood at the edge of the Winslow Estates, his arms wrapped tight around his thin body. 18 years old. His breath came in shivers, fogging the air. Hunger gnawed at him, but it was the cold that was killing him tonight. Then he saw her. She appeared like a ghost in the snow, barefoot, in a thin white nightgown that clung to her legs. Her silver hair was wild in the wind. Her skin, pale and fragile, nearly matched the snow. She walked slowly, as if in a dream, her hands outstretched like she was searching for something just beyond reach. Ethan blinked hard. Was she real? Then she spoke, just a whisper on the wind. "James, is that you, darling?" He moved without thinking. "Ma'am," he called, his voice cracking from cold and disbelief. "Are you okay?" She turned her head slowly toward him, eyes distant and unfocused. "My son's here," she said, voice trembling. "He's late. James hates being late." The snow was up to her ankles. Her toes were blue. "Jesus," Ethan whispered, moving toward her. "You're gonna die out here." She didn't seem to hear him. He could walk away. God knew the police wouldn't believe a homeless black kid wasn't trying to hurt her. But he couldn't. Not when she looked like his mama did. That last night, lost in her own kind of fog. He took off his blanket. He wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. "Come on," he said gently. "We'll get you warm." Dear viewer, before we begin, please write in the comments where you are watching from, and support us with a like and a subscribe. The old woman didn't resist when Ethan guided her gently toward a nearby bench beneath a leafless maple. She sat down slowly, the blanket falling over her thin frame like a cloak. He crouched in front of her, rubbing her arms to generate some heat. His fingers were red and numb, but he didn't care. "You got a name, ma'am?" he asked softly, watching her eyes flutter between reality and memory. "My name is Clara," she said, almost to herself. "Clara Winslow. My husband was James. My son is Henry. He's very busy." Ethan's heart skipped. Winslow. That name was on every building, every park sign, every gala invitation in the city. "You live around here?" he asked, though he was almost sure he already knew. She nodded faintly, looking around the street like it was the first time she'd ever seen it. "Somewhere, but it's not the same." "Nothing is." Her lips trembled. "I was looking for James. I think he said he'd meet me by the lake." "There's no lake here," Ethan said gently. "But it's okay. You're safe now." He took off his hoodie, thin as it was, and wrapped it around her legs. The wind howled down the street, making both of them flinch. Ethan sat beside her and pulled the blanket around them both, huddling close. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him like he was someone she remembered. "You're kind," she murmured. "My mama said, you'll never be poor if you still have kindness," Ethan replied, his voice barely a whisper. "She was the kindest person I knew." "Where is she now?" Clara asked, her voice drifting. He swallowed hard. "She passed. Couple years ago." Clara turned her head toward him, and for a moment, her eyes cleared. "You shouldn't be out here," she said. "It's too cold for boys like you." Ethan chuckled softly, the sound catching in his throat. "Yeah, well, ain't got much of a choice." The night deepened. The snow kept falling. And on that silent bench in the wealthiest street of the city, a forgotten old woman and a homeless teen kept each other alive, one heartbeat at a time. The early light of morning arrived in shades of ash and silver, creeping slowly over the rooftops of Winslow Estates. Snow sparkled like crushed diamonds, and silence still hung heavy over the sleeping neighborhood. But inside the Winslow mansion, silence shattered. "Where is she?" Henry Winslow's voice cracked through the hall like a whip. He had just returned from a red-eye flight, his suitcase still by the door, his overcoat slung hastily on the floor. "She was in her room at midnight," the housekeeper stammered. "The night nurse went to check at 4, and she was just gone." Henry's heart pounded as he marched toward the front door, his phone already at his ear. "Security. Now. I want every camera pulled from the street. If someone took her." But then he saw it. Through the frosted window beside the front entrance. Two figures, barely moving. huddled on the bench just beyond the gate. One small and pale, wrapped in an old blanket. The other dark-skinned and still, leaning protectively over her like a shield. He threw open the door, the cold slicing into his chest like a blade. "Mom," he called out, voice rough with fear. He stepped off the porch and began to run. The boy didn't move. As Henry got closer, he saw the frost clinging to the teenager's lashes, his lips pale, his fingers stiff where they held the blanket around Clara's shoulders. "Mom!" Henry dropped to his knees. "Mom, can you hear me?" Clara blinked slowly, turning her head. "Henry?" Her voice was thin, cracked. "You were late." Henry's throat tightened. He looked at the boy, startled. He was unconscious. And Henry realized, in that terrible moment, this stranger had given everything, maybe even his life, to keep Clara alive. "Call 911. Henry shouted over his shoulder. Now, he reached for the boy's pulse. Still there. Barely. The ambulance sirens would arrive soon. But nothing would ever be the same again. The ambulance's interior was a blur of lights, rushing air, and urgency. 2 EMTs worked quickly, adjusting oxygen masks and checking vitals, their gloved hands moving between the boy and the old woman. Clara lay on a stretcher, bundled in thermal blankets, her lips slowly regaining color. The boy, Ethan, was less stable. His body wasn't responding as quickly. Severe hypothermia. Borderline frostbite. The medic's voice was tense. He must have been out there for hours. Gave her everything he had. Henry sat across from them both, hunched forward, gripping the edge of the bench like it might keep him from falling apart. He couldn't stop staring. At his mother, her eyes half-lidded, her breathing shallow. And at the stranger beside her. A kid, barely more than a child. A kid who should have been invisible in this neighborhood. A kid who, by every unfair expectation of this world, should have been feared or ignored. And yet here he was. Clara's fingers twitched, reaching for something. She found Ethan's hand and curled her own frail one around it. Henry's breath caught. "My son," Clara mumbled. He was late, but this one he stayed. The EMT exchanged a glance with Henry. "She's been in and out. Probably some confusion from the dementia." But Henry wasn't so sure. There was clarity in her voice, a warmth in her words. They arrived at Mercy General 15 minutes later. The ER doors flew open, nurses rushing to meet the gurneys. Henry stepped out last, his shoes crunching on ice. As the boy disappeared behind sliding glass and medical urgency, Henry whispered, more to himself than anyone. "Who are you?" Hospitals have a way of swallowing time. 1 minute you're pacing a beige hallway, the next it's been hours. The world outside still turns, but inside, everything shrinks down to monitors, waiting rooms, and the smell of disinfectant. Henry sat with his elbows on his knees, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He hadn't called his assistant, hadn't answered any emails. His phone buzzed nonstop, but he ignored it all. His mother was stable now, warm, sleeping peacefully. But the boy, Ethan, they weren't sure. The doctor had explained the hypothermia, prolonged exposure, lowered body temperature, slowed heart rate. He'd collapsed just as the ambulance arrived. If it had been another hour. Henry didn't want to think about that. He rose and walked to the hallway outside Ethan's room. Through the small glass window, he saw the boy's chest rising slowly under thick blankets, and 4-line fed fluids into his arm. He looked younger in the hospital bed, fragile, but there was something fierce still in his jawline, even in sleep. The nurse walked by and paused beside Henry. "You know he wouldn't let go of her," she said softly. "When we tried to separate them in the ER, he kept whispering, 'She's cold. Keep her warm.'" Over and over. Henry turned his eyes back to the boy. "Does he have family?" The nurse shook her head. "No ID. No records in the system. Probably homeless. Cops found a duffel bag in the bushes near your property. Had a worn-out GED prep book, 2 shirts, and a photo of a woman with a note that just said, 'Be kind. Always.'" Henry felt something shift inside him. Heavy. Unfamiliar. He stared at the boy for a long time. Then said quietly, "When he wakes up, Tell him I'd like to speak with him. In person. The world came back to Ethan in fragments. Warmth, the soft beep of machines, the smell of antiseptic. Then pain. Not sharp, but dull and deep, like his bones had turned to lead. He blinked against the fluorescent light overhead, trying to sit up. Whoa, whoa, easy there. A nurse's voice. Gentle hands guiding him back down. You're safe. You're at mercy, General. You've been asleep for almost 12 hours. Ethan's throat was dry as dust. The lady. She's okay, the nurse said, smiling. She's alive. Thanks to you. Relief hit him like a wave. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping free before he could stop it. I didn't know what else to do, he croaked. You did everything right, she said, placing a cup of ice chips in his hand. You saved her life. She paused, as if unsure whether to say more. Then, someone's been waiting to talk to you. He's been out there all night. Ethan looked confused. Who? The door opened, and in stepped Henry Winslow. Tall, commanding, still in his travel clothes, though his tie was loosened and his coat dusted with snow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Henry took a step closer and said simply, You're Ethan, right? Ethan nodded slowly. Henry looked at him, really looked at him, and what he saw wasn't a threat or a problem to be solved. It was a boy, a brave, freezing, broken-hearted boy who had risked everything to save a stranger. I owe you my mother's life, Henry said quietly. And Ethan, unsure what to do with gratitude that big, just whispered, She reminded me of someone. Henry sat in the chair beside Ethan's bed, his posture tense, but his eyes softer now. Less businessman, more son. I need to ask you something, he said, his voice low. Why didn't you run? Ethan blinked slowly. I thought about it. I was scared. I didn't know how it'd look. Me, holding a white woman like that. In that neighborhood. Henry nodded. You were right to be scared. There was no pride in his voice, just shame. The truth hung between them like frost in the air. But you stayed anyway. Ethan didn't reply. My mother's alive because of you, Henry continued. And I don't know what kind of world lets someone like you sleep on a bench while people like me throw away more money than you've probably ever seen. Ethan's eyes flicked to the window. It's just how it is. Henry leaned forward. I don't want it to be. He reached into his coat and pulled out a card. I have a guest house. Empty. Heated. Private. You could stay there for a while, until you figure out your next step. Ethan's eyes narrowed, suspicious. Why? Henry paused. Because I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking the world is only safe for people who look like her. Because I owe you. And because you didn't run. Ethan stared at the card for a long time before reaching out with trembling fingers. Just a few days, he said. Till I get back on my feet. Henry nodded. But they both knew. This was more than a place to sleep. It was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. The guest house was nestled behind the Winslow estate like a forgotten promise. Warm light glowing through its windows, a soft trail of footprints in the snow leading from the main house. Ethan stood on the porch with a backpack slung over one shoulder, still unsure if he should knock. Part of him expected a trap, or for the door to vanish the second he reached for it. But it opened before he touched it. And there she was, 9 years old, arms crossed, bare feet on the polished floor like she owned the world. You're the guy who saved my grandma, she said, squinting up at him. Ethan blinked. Yeah, I guess. I'm Sophie. She tilted her head. You're younger than I thought. You're bolder than I expected, he said, half smiling. She grinned. You want cookies or what? He stepped inside, surprised by the warmth, and not just from the fireplace. There were blankets on the couch, a tray of soup on the kitchen table, a folded note in neat handwriting. Make yourself at home. Henry. Sophie plopped onto the armchair and gestured like a queen inviting someone into court. My mom used to say that when someone saves your family, they become family. Ethan froze for a second, unsure what to say. Sophie leaned forward. You got anyone? He shook his head. Had a mom. She passed. It's just me now. She nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. Then, gently, Then I guess we're your people now. Ethan sat down across from her, his throat suddenly tight. He had no idea how long he'd been waiting to hear something like that. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep curled up under a blanket on the guest house couch, halfway through explaining the plot of her favorite movie, Ethan wandered into the small den. The walls were lined with old books, the kind that weren't just for show, spines cracked, corners bent. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a row of framed photographs. He stepped closer. One showed a young Henry Winslow, maybe college age, standing stiffly beside a woman in a military uniform. His mother, Clara. Her eyes were sharp back then, proud. In another photo, a younger Sophie grinned with her front teeth missing, held in the arms of a woman with warm eyes and curly dark hair. Ethan stared at that one for a long time. The woman was mixed race, maybe black, maybe biracial. And suddenly he understood why Sophie looked at him like she already knew him. Her mother had been like him. There were no recent photos of her. His eyes moved to the last frame, a small, simple one. A funeral card. Her name, Elena Grace Winslow. Died 3 years ago. He didn't hear Henry enter until the man was standing behind him, quiet as the snow outside. She died of cancer, Henry said. We caught it too late. Ethan turned, unsure what to say. She was the one who softened me, Henry continued. Before her, everything in my life was numbers, deals, strategy. After her, it was just Sophie. He paused. She's still grieving, but she hides it better than I do. Ethan looked back at the photos. She's a good kid, he said softly. Henry nodded. She hasn't smiled like that in months. Not until you walked through the door. They stood there, two very different men connected by something they didn't yet understand. Not yet, but soon. The next morning, snow still dusted the ground, but inside the guest house, warmth lived in the scent of pancakes and Sophie's off-key humming from the kitchen. Ethan sat at the small table, staring at a stack of clothes folded neatly beside his plate. A simple sweatshirt, a pair of jeans, socks, and a note. Thought you might need these. H. He ran his hand over the fabric and used the softness that came without strings. Across from him, Sophie poured way too much syrup on her pancakes and grinned. You look like someone who's never had breakfast that didn't come from a gas station. Ethan smirked. You're not far off. You like school? She asked suddenly between bites. He shrugged. I liked learning, but I had to drop out after my mom passed. Been trying to get my GED, though? Sophie nodded. You should. You're smart. Smarter than my teacher. She thinks the Underground Railroad was an actual train. Ethan chuckled. I believe it. A knock sounded at the door. Henry stepped in, dressed sharp as always, but with a gentler look today. There's something I want to show you, he said to Ethan. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sky was pale blue. Henry led him around the side of the property to a small garage. Inside was a modest desk, a space heater, shelves of books, and a laptop. I had this built last year. Meant it as a quiet place to think. Turns out, I never used it. He looked at Ethan. It's yours if you want it. A place to study. For your GED. For whatever comes next. Ethan stared at the space, unable to speak for a moment. No one's ever done something like this for me. Henry nodded. Then let's make that a new habit. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't dared to feel. Hope. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Ethan woke early. He helped the housekeeper with firewood. He shoveled the walkway without being asked. He read from his GED prep book in the garage, highlighter in hand, notes taped to the walls. At night, he and Sophie played chess on the porch, their breath fogging in the cold. She always won. He suspected she let him think otherwise. Clara wondered less now. Some days, she didn't remember Sophie's name, but she always remembered Ethan. James, she'd whisper sometimes, reaching for his hand. And Ethan never corrected her. He just sat beside her and told her stories about gardens they never planted and children they never had, and a life that might have belonged to someone like her and someone like him in a different world. Henry watched it all from a distance. One evening, after a long business call, he stepped out into the yard, and found Ethan sitting with Clara on the bench, the same one from that freezing night. Ethan had his mother's blanket around Clara's shoulders, and he was reading aloud from a book of poems. Clara's head rested on his shoulder, eyes closed, smiling. Henry stood there, silent. There were things money couldn't buy, and here, right in front of him, was proof of it. It happened the following week. Sophie had gone to bed early. Clara was resting peacefully. Ethan sat in the main house's library, flipping through a thick book on sociology, one of Henry's. A storm cracked against the windows outside. Henry walked in with 2 mugs of tea and set one beside Ethan. "I heard you passed your practice test," he said, taking a seat across from him. "Barely," Ethan replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "But it's something." "It's more than something," Henry said. "It's the beginning." They sat in silence for a moment. The fire crackled in the hearth. The room smelled of wood smoke and old pages. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said finally. Henry nodded. "Why me? Out of all the people in this city, why open your door to me?" Henry stared into his tea. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, "Because I almost lost her. And in the moment I found her again, she wasn't clinging to me. She was clinging to you." His voice cracked slightly. "And maybe because when I looked at you, I saw someone I could have been. Or maybe someone I still want to be." Ethan swallowed hard. Henry continued. "You could have run. You could have taken her ring, her coat, anything. But you didn't. You gave her the only thing you had left." He met Ethan's eyes. "That's not weakness. That's power. And this world needs more people like you in it." The firelight danced between them, melting years of silence, grief, and fear. In that quiet warmth, 2 lives that had never been meant to cross began to intertwine, like threads pulled gently toward something bigger, something whole. By the next weekend, word had spread. Not through tabloids or the evening news. Henry had made sure of that, but in quieter circles. A billionaire's mother, rescued in the snow. A nameless teen found beside her, nearly frozen to death, now living on the estate. The whispers reached the city's elite like a ripple in still water. At first, the calls were polite. "Is it true you've taken in a street boy?" "Just concerned for Clara's safety, of course." "Is this temporary?" Henry ignored most of them. But the real storm came the day a newspaper landed on the Winslow front porch. Ethan picked it up that morning. The headline didn't name him, but the photo said enough. A grainy image of him walking with Sophie in the park, her hand wrapped around his. Beneath it, stranger in the snow, the teen who walked into a billionaire's life. He stared at the page for a long time before walking into the kitchen and handing it to Henry without a word. Henry scanned the article, his jaw tightening. "They don't even know your name," he muttered. "I'm not surprised," Ethan said. "To them, I'm just a curiosity. A good headline." There was a knock at the front door. When Henry opened it, he found a man in a crisp suit standing on the porch. "I'm with the foundation board," he said coolly. "Some of our donors are expressing concern." "Concern about what?" Henry asked. The man's eyes flicked toward the guest house. "About optics." Henry didn't respond at first. Then he said clearly, without apology, "If our donors are more worried about optics than about people, then they're welcome to donate elsewhere." He closed the door. Behind him, Ethan stood quietly. "You didn't have to do that," Ethan said. Henry turned. "Yes, I did." Because this time, he wasn't going to let fear, or politics, undo something that was finally right. Spring came slow but steady. The snow melted into soft patches of grass, and tiny shoots of green pushed through the earth like second chances. Clara no longer recognized her room, but she always remembered the garden, her favorite place, even in her confusion. Ethan found her there one afternoon, sitting in a chair with her face lifted to the sun, her blanket tucked neatly around her lap. "I used to grow hydrangeas here," she said dreamily. Ethan knelt beside her. "What color?" "Blue," she whispered. "The kind that only bloom when the soil is just right. Not too proud, not too bitter." He smiled. "Sounds like you." Clara chuckled faintly, then looked at him, her eyes clearing for a moment. "You remind me of someone." "James." Ethan asked softly. No, she said after a pause. Better. You remind me of the son I should have raised. The one who listens with his heart. Ethan looked down, his throat tight. That afternoon, he passed his GED. Henry had waited outside the testing center in silence, pretending to answer emails while Ethan stared at the envelope with shaking hands. He opened it. Passed. Every subject. When he looked up, Henry just nodded once, then pulled him into a hug. It was the first time Ethan had been held like that since his mother died, and it felt like a beginning. It was Henry's idea at first. A passing comment over coffee one morning while Clara watched birds from the kitchen window. She always believed in giving back, he said, stirring his cup slowly. Even when she didn't know what year it was, she knew what kindness meant. Ethan nodded. She saved me too, you know. That night, she looked at me like I was someone worth saving. Henry looked up. What if we made that the mission? They spent weeks building it out. Henry handled the business structure, the funding, the paperwork. Ethan brought the soul. They called it the Clara Winslow Foundation. Its mission was simple: provide housing, education, and mentorship for homeless and foster youth, especially those aging out of the system with nowhere to go. Sophie drew the logo herself, a hand holding another against a rising sun. The first office was a refurbished wing of the old community center. Henry paid for the renovation, but Ethan insisted on painting the walls himself. He chose blue. Hydrangea blue, he said, smiling as the first coat went on. Word spread. Local shelters started referring teens to the program. Volunteers signed up. A social worker named Marla joined full-time, and she swore she'd never seen a director who understood the kids like Ethan did. They listened to you, she said one afternoon, watching him play cards with a 16-year-old who hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 weeks. Because you've been where they are. Ethan didn't say anything, but he knew she was right. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving. He was building something. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Sophie pulled Ethan into the main house by the hand. I have something to show you, she said, grinning. Close your eyes. He followed her up the stairs, past the hallway lined with portraits and memories, until they stopped at the door to what used to be the upstairs guest room. Okay, she whispered. Open. The room had been transformed. On the wall, painted in wide strokes of soft lavender and sky blue, were the words, You belong here. Beneath them sat a simple bed with fresh linens, a small desk, a shelf already holding books Ethan had mentioned he wanted to read, a framed photo of the three of them, Sophie, Henry, and Ethan, taken in the garden just a few weeks before. Ethan stared, speechless. Sophie nudged him. You said the guest house felt like a stop. This is your room. In the real house. Not just the back house. Not just for now. Ethan looked at her, then at Henry, who stood quietly in the doorway. I didn't want to assume, Ethan said, his voice hoarse. Henry stepped inside, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to, he said. Family doesn't need to knock. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He stepped into the room slowly, reverently, like it might disappear if he moved too fast. But it didn't. It was real. It was his. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe. He was home. Clara's decline came quietly. She began to sleep more, eat less. Some days, she forgot where she was. Other days, she thought Sophie was her younger self and Ethan her husband. But she was never scared. Not anymore. Because Ethan was always there. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the window, Clara handed Ethan a folded piece of paper. For you, she whispered. He opened it carefully, the paper fragile in his fingers. Inside was a letter written in shaky, elegant script. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I remembered. Maybe not everything, but enough. You saved my life, not just in the snow, but every day after. You gave me warmth when the world gave you cold. You gave me your mother's blanket, and in return, I give you something more, my love. I don't know what family means anymore, but I know that if I had another grandson, I would want him to be exactly like you. I may forget names, dates, faces, but I will never forget how you made me feel. Safe, seen, and deeply loved. Be proud of the man you are becoming. You are everything this world needs more of. Love always. Clara. Ethan sat with her for a long time that day, holding her hand as the rain fell. And when she drifted off to sleep, he stayed, reading the letter again and again, letting it become part of him. The morning she passed was peaceful. Sophie was curled at the foot of Clara's bed, her tiny hand resting on her grandmother's blanket. Henry stood by the window, silent, still. And Ethan held Clara's hand until the very last breath left her body, soft as a sigh. No machines, no alarms, just quiet. The hospice nurse nodded gently. She went easy. That's rare. But Ethan knew it wasn't just ease. It was peace. Later that afternoon, while the sun cast long shadows across the wintergreen lawn, the family gathered under the garden trellis, Clara's favorite spot. There was no big service, no public eulogy, just the three of them and a few close friends, honoring the woman who had somehow connected them all. Henry spoke first, his voice tight. She built this family, he said. Even when she didn't know where she was, she remembered how to love. And in the end, she taught me more than any boardroom or deal ever could. Sophie added a flower to the growing pile by the trellis. She said I was brave, even when I wasn't. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stepped forward, unfolding the letter one last time. I didn't have a grandmother, he said softly. Not until her. And I don't know how the world works. Why some people have to freeze while others sleep under roofs like this. But I know one thing. He looked at them, at Henry, at Sophie. She gave me a reason to keep going, a reason to be better. And now, I'm going to make her proud. They buried her ashes beneath the hydrangea bush she used to talk about in her dreams. And as the wind picked up, petals fell like snow. It was a year later when Ethan stood behind the podium. He wore a crisp navy suit, his first, and a pin on his lapel shaped like a hydrangea bloom. The Clara Winslow Foundation's first youth center had just opened its doors. The ribbon-cutting crowd was larger than expected. Local officials, students, social workers, volunteers. But Ethan didn't look at them. He looked for the ones in the back. The ones who kept their eyes low. The ones who never thought they'd be welcomed through any door like this. Then he began. I was 18 years old and sleeping under a bridge the night I met Clara Winslow. I didn't know her name. I didn't know who she was. All I knew was she was cold and lost and barefoot in the snow. He paused, his hands steady on the sides of the podium. I should have walked away. I was scared. Scared of what the world would think if it saw me with her. But my mama taught me, you'll never be poor if you still have kindness. So I stayed. I gave her the only thing I had left. My blanket. My warmth. He scanned the crowd, letting the silence settle. That one decision changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone I've met since. He motioned to the center behind him. This building isn't a gift. It's a promise that no one should have to prove they're worthy of help. That dignity doesn't belong to the rich or the powerful. It belongs to everyone. He closed with the words he'd written on the wall of his room months ago. The people who stay when the world turns away become your real family. The room rose in applause. But Ethan's eyes weren't on the cameras. They were on a shy 15-year-old in the back row, arms folded, eyes wet. And Ethan knew. It was beginning again. Later that evening, after the celebration faded and the lights of the new youth center dimmed, Ethan stepped outside for air. The city skyline glowed in the distance, but the real light came from inside. The sound of teens laughing, the warm clatter of dishes, someone playing an out-of-tune guitar. Henry joined him on the steps. You nailed the speech, he said. Ethan smiled. Wasn't a speech. It was just truth. They stood side by side, the silence between them no longer heavy, but easy. You know, Henry said, glancing over. My board wants to offer you a position. Director of Outreach. Comes with a salary. Ethan blinked. You serious? You've already been doing the job. Might as well make it official. Ethan looked out across the street, where a group of kids stood in line outside the shelter. That's not why I do it. I know, Henry said. That's exactly why we want you. There was a pause. Then Henry added, "Clara would be proud." Ethan nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I hope so." As they turned to go back inside, a familiar figure caught Ethan's eye, a young teen standing at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the building with a mix of hope and fear. The boy looked maybe 14. Dirty jacket, no bag, just eyes full of that particular kind of hunger Ethan remembered too well. He walked toward him. "You looking for someone?" Ethan asked. The kid flinched, took a step back. "I'm not here for trouble," he said quickly. "Just saw the sign. Didn't know if I was allowed to come in." Ethan smiled gently. "You are now." He pulled off his coat, wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. "You cold?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Come on," Ethan said. "Let's get you warm." Inside the center, the boy barely spoke at first. He sat stiffly on the couch near the heater, hands buried in Ethan's coat sleeves, eyes darting from one unfamiliar face to another. Ethan brought him hot cocoa, no questions asked. Sophie, now 10 and infinitely wiser, plopped down next to him and started chatting about video games until the boy cracked a half smile. Later, when the others had gone to bed, Ethan found him in the quiet lounge, staring at the photos lining the wall. Pictures of the Foundation's early days. Clara in the garden. Sophie holding a paint roller twice her size. Ethan, mid-laugh, covered in plaster dust. The boy looked up. "Is that your grandma?" Ethan nodded. In every way that mattered. "She looks happy." She was. She made people feel like they belonged. The boy hesitated. "You really used to be on the street?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Yeah." "What changed?" Ethan walked to a cabinet in the corner. He opened it, pulled something out, and came back holding a folded, faded blanket, the one he'd wrapped around Clara that night in the snow. He handed it to the boy. "This," he said, "this changed everything." The boy stared at the blanket like it was made of gold. "It's just a blanket," he said softly. "No," Ethan replied. "It's a beginning." He draped it gently over the kid's shoulders. And just like that, another life began to shift. Weeks passed. The boy, whose name was Jordan, began to settle in. Slowly at first. A meal here. A few hours of sleep there. Then entire nights, a full backpack, a sketch pad he carried everywhere, but never let anyone see. Ethan didn't push. He remembered what it felt like to be handled, not held. One evening, Jordan wandered into Ethan's office, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "I drew something," he mumbled, placing it on the desk. Ethan unfolded the page carefully. It was a sketch of the garden at the Winslow estate. Clara on the bench, Sophie nearby, Henry with a shovel, Ethan kneeling in the soil planting blue hydrangeas. He stared at it, stunned. "It's beautiful," Ethan said. "You remember all this?" Jordan shrugged. "I didn't think I remembered anything. But I guess, sometimes the good stuff stays." He hesitated. Who was she? Ethan's voice was soft. Her name was Clara Winslow. "She saved my life." Jordan looked down. "How?" "By seeing me," Ethan said. "By remembering who I was when even I had forgotten." Jordan nodded slowly. Then, after a long pause, he asked, "You think she would have seen me too?" Ethan smiled. "She already has." And he pointed to the wall behind them, where a quote from Clara, painted in soft cursive, stretched above the door. "No one is lost forever. Not if someone is still willing to find them." Jordan turned to look at it, and for the first time, he stood a little taller. One crisp morning, Henry walked beside Ethan through the city park where the Foundation's second youth center was being built. Construction noises echoed in the distance, but the air between them was calm. "She would have loved this," Henry said, nodding toward the new brick facade. "Right in the neighborhood she grew up in. Same trees, same soil." Ethan smiled. "She's in all of it now. The garden, the center, the kids." They stopped at a bronze plaque mounted near the walkway. Clara's name was etched across the top, beneath it her quote in full. "Kindness is the only inheritance worth leaving." Henry exhaled slowly. "You know," he said, "I used to think legacy meant stock options and board seats." "And now?" Ethan asked. Henry glanced at him. "Now I think it's about who remembers your name when they're finally warm." They walked in silence for a few steps. Then Henry added, "You've made something real, Ethan. Something that's going to outlive all of us." Ethan shook his head. "We made it." A few feet away, Jordan laughed with Sophie under a tree, her hand in his, their sketchbooks open in the grass between them. Henry watched them, eyes distant. "It's funny," he said. "I thought I was saving you that night." Ethan looked toward the bench where it all began. "You did," he said. But they both knew it went both ways. It started with a clip, just 60 seconds from Ethan's latest speech at the Foundation's anniversary event. Someone in the crowd recorded it, posted it late at night with the caption, "Listen to this. Just listen." By morning, it had 2 million views. In the video, Ethan stood alone on stage, no script, no suit, just a microphone and the truth. "I used to think being poor meant having nothing. But I had kindness. I had courage. I had a mother who gave me her last breath and a blanket that kept another woman alive. I was invisible until someone saw me. I was frozen until someone stayed." This world doesn't change through money or politics. It changes when someone chooses to be brave and kind at the same time. People listened. News outlets reached out. Schools requested his story. Donations to the Clara Winslow Foundation surged overnight. But Ethan didn't care about the numbers. He cared about the messages. From kids in foster homes who finally believed they could matter. From young men who'd grown up hearing they were threats, now hearing they could be heroes. And from a woman in Vermont who wrote, "My son was on the street. Now he's in your program. Thank you for saving him." Ethan printed that letter, framed it, hung it beside the original sketch Jordan had drawn of the garden. Not for the praise, but for the proof. That one moment of kindness on a freezing night had sparked a fire, and the world was finally beginning to feel its warmth. It was snowing again. Soft flakes drifted through the air, covering the sidewalk in a thin white hush. Ethan stood at the same bench where it had all begun, where he'd found Clara, barefoot and lost, searching for a life that was already behind her. Now, he sat there again, coat pulled tight, an old thermos in his hands, watching the street. Waiting. A figure approached slowly from the corner. A girl, maybe 16. Soaked hoodie, torn backpack, eyes sharp with fear but dulled by hunger. She hesitated when she saw him. He smiled, just enough to be gentle. "You okay?" he asked. She shrugged, instinctively bracing to be ignored. Dismissed. Feared. Ethan stood, removed his coat, and held it out. "I've got something warm," he said. "And there's a place just down the street. Real food, real beds, real people." The girl blinked, caught between disbelief and need. "I don't have anything," she whispered. Ethan held her gaze. "You don't have to. That's not what makes you worthy." She stepped closer. He draped the coat around her shoulders. And as they walked through the falling snow, toward the light of the youth center, Ethan glanced back at the bench one last time. Not to relive the past, but to honor it. Because kindness didn't end that night. It began there. And now it lived on. In every warm coat. In every open door. In every stranger brave enough to stay. Thank you for watching. Subscribe me and hit the notification bell to not miss new stories. Bye.